Well, good morning, good afternoon. Um, Sorry for the slight delay. As of course, it happens the minute you try and do something technologically, it desired decides to go back to the dark ages on you. So, my name is Mary Jane Maurice. Most people call me MJ. I'm a Master Maltster, and I am the Director of Technical Services for Malt Europe North America, Malt Europe Malting Company, and want to talk a little bit about what climate change would mean for basically the barley supply chain. And we know that other crops are affected as well that affect the brewing process. But my focus is going to be on barley because that's that's my entire 31 year career has been in malting. So I want to say a special thank you to craft brewing professionals for providing this content, um, to Malt Europe for allowing me to do this. Um, Beer 30 by the Fifth Ingredient, and what they do is they sponsor and help keep this program free and available to you. And that's a huge thing because it really helps with the educational platform that it's not restricted or fee-based. It allows more people to see all of the great talks that are going to be presented. And thank you to Mother Nature because she's forever giving us something to talk about, whether it's easy or not. So I just did a little bit of a flashback. I actually spoke on barley and malt impact, um, the impact of climate change on those in 2009 to the American Society of Brewing Chemists and the Master Brewers Association of America. But already we knew 13 years ago and even longer that really this is going to be a huge question for the entire food supply chain across the world. Uh, it, uh, it's not just um, those things that we do for pleasure, beer, whiskey, and things like that, but it's about avoiding famine in some of the locations that are really dry in the world. So what we did at that time, we weren't really sure is what the change was going to be, and it has been slightly different in different areas of the world. And at that point, we didn't really know what the climate model for the U.S. in particular was going to be. And there was a possibility that it was going to be cooler and wetter, which would have uh, made the disease more intense and widespread. Also, if it's cool and wetter, that extends the growing season, and that later ripening exposes you to the chance of pre-harvest sprouting, where basically the plant tries to do the malting process out in the field. What we got in the U.S. and Canada is the second of these two possibilities. The change is warmer and drier, and honestly, it's hotter and droughtier, if that is a term that I can use. And what that impacts really is lower plump and extract, which is ultimately what drives alcohol production. The higher protein in the beta glucan, because they're protective mechanisms to help the barley kernel withstand these kinds of growing conditions. And if it's just warmer and not the drought, uh, we knew that corn was pushing farther and farther into what we call barley country as it is. but that would allow the corn to go into just areas that had been dominated by barley. And we have seen a lot of switching from canola and soy and corn in the plains, places like North Dakota, and it really has pushed our barley draw areas largely to the north and the west from there. So on this graph I took, and this all comes from the USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service, and I looked at I think they go back to 1960s or 1860 something, and but 1942 was the largest crop in terms of harvested acres, and these are million acres, and you can see that first data point and where we are right now, and basically because the 1 point is so big, the change seems kind of subtle between 20 and 21, but when we get into things like bushels per acre, you really get a chance to see how much of a difference that makes. So probably you may have seen some of the communications out there that this is the smallest barley crop since 1900, and that's just, to me, mind-boggling, especially since yield has gotten so much better during the course of time during these years. But you can really see even from say 2003, 2004, what has happened, and a lot of that is the inability to get onto the irrigated acres as much as we would like, and the fact that really corn has displaced barley in a number of locations, and corn is also host for some of the diseases, which increase the risk to the grower and to the industry. So in 1942, part of the reason why we needed that many acres being harvested is because the barley yield was only about 25 bushels per acre at that point. And by the year 2000, we had gotten up around 60. Actually, we had a very large crop in 2016. I think it was like 78 bushels per acre. But what we see is that drastic drop off at the end between 2020 and 2021, and that's just that is a function of drought. It's something that's very difficult for anyone in the supply chain to truly impact or make a difference. We can try some remediation in the malt house. There can be some in the brewery, and definitely trying to pick varieties that are a little bit more drought resistant. But Mother Nature, she rules the show, and so what she gives us in a given crop year is what makes our ability to grow sufficient quantities and sufficient qualities to meet all of the demands of the industry. So on the left here, you have looking at July 2000, because July is typically the time when the grain is filling and the starch to protein ratio is really set. So in July of 2000, we had some areas that were warmer, but not to the degree that we see on the right hand from July 2021. And pretty much everything that, we see some barley grown on the on the eastern seaboard and areas that haven't had it for many years, but pretty much you've got the entirety of the U.S. barley growing area is sitting in that either lighter to darker red, indicating the increasing temperature. The barley might be able to handle a little bit of that increasing temperature, but the main problem is the lack of rainfall. So there unfortunately aren't as many predictions, so I could only go back to 2013. But this was the drought tendency prediction models for August of 2013. And you can see, yes, we knew areas were going to continue or worsen, but when you look at the right-hand slide from September 2021, again, it's going to continue or worsen, and that is again covering all of the primary barley acreage that we have. Some spots in Colorado look okay, but yeah, it's not. It doesn't look like we have an easy fix for this, that's for sure. So, how does drought affect barley? Well, barley has no idea what we intend to do it, and it has no idea of the noble purpose that it's going to serve in the brewing and also in the distilling industries. So it really thinks what it's going to do is in fall it's going to drop to the ground. It's going to overwinter, and particularly in those areas that have snow, when the snow melts and the soil starts warming up, that barley kernel thinks that it's going to become a new plant. So everything is very much set up to allow that to happen. We sometimes forget that what we're really trying to do in the malting process is duplicate these growth stages for much shorter time, but in the malting process, we are using all the same enzymes that were in the barley or would develop in the barley if it was going to copy this growth tendency. And when you get to grain filling, so at the bottom you can see the days after flowering, so after anthesis, you'd see at the beginning there's not much protein, not much starch, but the protein will come up and then level off. But the starch, you can see that that's a pretty steep curve between, say, day 10 and day 30, and then it holds pretty much from there. So once that starch is in the kernel, once that protein is in the kernel, there is basically nothing we can do to change that, unfortunately. We can do a lot of things in the malt plant. We know that from all the different types of malt we can make. But as far as changing what Mother Nature has given us, we unfortunately don't have the control that we would like to of that. I think I'd be a very rich woman if I could figure that out. So when the drought hits, most of the protein component is already formed, but the starch has not yet filled up the kernel. And just like we have protective mechanisms in our body to try and keep us healthy and safe, the kernel has those as well. So it'll deposit more beta glucan, which locks in whatever starch and protein is in that kernel, in order to help it make it through until the ground warms up and you get the spring rains out in the field again. So if you don't have enough moisture, it's not enough. It's not enough to get the starch granules to expand. Um, During the malting process, during the barley growing process, um, there's a definite expansion in the kernel as the water is taken up by the starch granules. And if those starch granules aren't very aren't able to expand like that, the kernel itself doesn't expand. And what you can get is the thin barley that really affects milling. And ultimately, because the ratio of protein to starch has gone more in the favor of protein, there is insufficient starch left in the kernel to achieve your normal or maximum, optimum, however you want to say it, alcohol production. And that's, we want things with wonderful flavor and all that, but the basic job is to make alcohol. So it is definitely affected by that. So where does the moisture that the barley needs come from? Really, rain is only one part of that picture. There's actually a lot more that comes from different parts of the climate. Barley is known for needing cool nights to kind of rest and replenish. It is one of the faster growth cycles for the grains and general field crops. So in order to get all of the development of the plant and the kernels, it's quite active. So that cooler time, it gives it really the chance to renew its energy and replenish moisture. And so dew is very important there. Well, dew kind of disappears, as we all know, as the temperature gets warmer, and you just don't get that. But the reservoir levels that are used in order to support irrigation distance, they are also all affected by the lessening of rain, the lessening of dew. Irrigation is meant to augment the moisture in the kernel, but it does not replace the normal expected effect of rain and dew. And one of the key points to this is snowpack. Basically, snowpack from either side of the Rockies is one of the principal sources of water for the reservoirs, which then becomes your irrigation water. So the depth of the snowpack in different areas, better it is, the better year we'll have with barley. But if it's damaged or you have a low snowpack, it really just does not. There just is the water available in those reservoirs. So this is a study of the reservoirs in storage, and this is at the end of September. There has been some restocking, if you will, of the reservoir storage at the end, where some of it is getting into that green area, where it's close to the 1981 to 2000 average. But you can see Northern California, Northern Nevada, all the way down into the southeast in New Mexico and Arizona, still suffering quite a bit from drought, and that also affects the pull of water to more densely populated areas. There's the joke that in Montana, there's more cows than people, which means they don't put quite as much strain. You don't have quite as much of a human strain on the system. But in terms of growing crops, it is quite dramatic. If you look at some of the ones on the far left, 8 and 7 and 6% of normal reservoir storage, that is catastrophic, because even if you are on irrigated ground, you can't get the water to irrigate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact on the growers, and then on the maltsters, and then what it means for the brewers. Corn and Sly have already pushed barley into dry regions. Corn takes a tremendous amount of water to grow, and that's part of the reason why it takes up acreage where we used to grow barley. I never thought I would see in my career corn being grown in Canada, just because of the short growing season, because the amount of available water. But as in particular, as we have modified corn and soy to be Roundup ready and things like that, that has allowed the corn and these crops to be planted where normally they would be much more susceptible to disease. Also, the feed market isn't what it used to be. Ever since you had the real turnover into the use of DDGs and things like that for animal feed, we really have seen a drop off in the feed market, and it gets to the point where the cost to grow can actually, be higher than the cost the grower receives, even if they don't make malting quality. So it's it's a risky proposition for them, because you have your input costs. If you're irrigated, you pay for the water you irrigate with. If you are looking at things like nitrogen, fertilizing, things like that, the input costs, you put it in early in the year for a lot of these, but then when you get into this drought pattern later on, you really can't keep up with that. And the thing that we try to do, because you saw the loss in barley acreage, we need to try and keep the growers, we as maltsters need to try and keep the growers as sound and risk reduced as possible. And so we really try not to reject barley, especially in the US. Canada grows a lot more barley, but they have a much lower selection rate, whereas our selection rates are quite high in the US. So I'm talking about countermeasures, and the reason why I chose that term is because solutions aren't really appropriate. That we can't solve drought to an immediate degree, but we can do things to make the impact of it as little as possible. One nice thing is when it's dry, the disease pressure is generally very low because all your fungi and things like that really require a lot of moisture. Crop rotation, you can only do so much of that because in terms of the big picture in grains and cereals growing, barley actually is among the lowest of both growing season and total moisture requirements. Barley, especially in over the course of my career, has become a lot shorter. So we're breeding uh, we're breeding plants that the focus is more on the ear rather than on the straw, which doesn't do anything for us in the beverage production side of things. So it's a good thing that we do need less moisture than some of the other crops. And irrigation is not the magic wand that we would like it to be. There's a lack of availability of more acres that can be irrigated. And it's also, again, things like snowpack that drive the amount of water in the reservoirs. That is also threatened by drought and heat. So one of the main focuses has been to change the barley selection that we make. We're spring barley here. Europe, in particular, has more of the winter barley variety, but that is a much more maritime type climate rather than the pretty brutal climate we can see in North America. So what they're looking for is means to, by crossing barley varieties, because barley is non-GMO, can't there's no willingness and not enough cash to go that route. So we're looking at sources of barley and stress resistance and drought resistance, and things like fertilizer uptake efficiency. And these are really high priorities for research, especially in North America, in your drier countries of the world, Australia, Mexico, where they grow barley. We're really looking for the varieties that are going to be more successful in the difficult years that we somehow keep seeing. We were talking about a normal crop here with a bunch of colleagues, and we're not so sure we know what a normal crop year is anymore, because it's just been too many crops with different issues. Impact on the maltsters. Whatever barley's out there costs more, especially when, like this year, 30% change in the bushels per acre, and the production bushels that were harvested. So there's less barley, and it's a tougher barley to work with for both the maltster and the brewer. So what we have to fight is growers wanting to grow something less risky. Fortunately, there's a lot of crops that can't grow in the barley growing areas, so that it's not good for the grower, but good for the maltster. Is these areas are barley and wheat land, and so there's not really the chance of putting something that's less risky in that area. and that's they don't have the option to do that as much as they can. Quite honestly, if we think the crop was small this year, if some of these other crops could grow on barley ground, we'd be in even a bigger hurt. So what happens when we have a small crop like this, we have to increase the percentage of the crop that we select. And unfortunately, that means we have to take barley that we would normally reject in a normal crop year, if we can even describe normal anymore. So we're paying more for the barley, and we have to take barley that usually does not put us in the best situation in order to make the brewery specs. High protein barley is a lot tougher to hydrate and to break down the cell wall components. So it can be a real challenge in that way. What we absolutely don't want to see is on-farm blending into a better non-rejectable protein or plumpness. The solution to pollution is not dilution. The lower protein and the higher protein, particularly in steeping, they will behave differently. So when a grower mixes some of his higher and his lower in order to get more that meets spec, that can really be a nightmare for trying to drive consistency in the malt house and its effects on the breweries. And really, brewers' expectations continue to increase. The levels of starch, particularly in the craft industry, the level of protein and the enzymes, that's getting much more difficult than it used to be. And we manage some of that through variety selection, but the specs are more difficult than when I started some years back. So some of the things we can do as maltsters is use our procurement stance to increase the diversity of regions. Usually what you have is you have a portion of the crop that's having a tougher than usual year, a good portion that's having a normal year, and then some of it usually as having a bumper crop year. And so by having a larger regional coverage, you have the opportunity to get some of each of those scenarios. And I'm sure you've read in different trade publications, there is barley moving into the U.S. and Canada from other parts of the world that weren't quite as hard hit by the drought. What we can do in malting is we can find whatever starch is in there by increasing the starch, the steep out moisture. So basically breaking down the cell walls during the malting process in order to get there. We, again, cannot fix the barley in the malt house. We can release whatever starch we can, but again, that protein starch ratio is fixed. We can remove small kernels, but when you have the smell of a crop, that really makes it difficult to cover your entire demand if you remove a lot of the small kernels. And I know it's something that we are doing, and I'm sure others are doing, is slowing down the crop changeover. In other words, trying to stretch the 2020 crop as long as we can, so that there isn't this black and white distinction between 2020 and 2021 crop. So we're trying to use that to balance. So the impact on the brewers, the reduced alcohol production, and that may require adjusting the grain bill. You know, enough in order to get your target gravities, you may need to use more malt. You know, barley prices are going up, which translates to the entire system. So you're paying a little bit more just to get coverage. And higher protein means higher free amino nitrogen, and that can alter the course of fermentation. So that can be a little bit tougher for the brewer. And there's likely to be conversion time and temperature adjustments that need to be changed just because of the relative levels of things like DP that you see in a high protein crop. And the thing is, climate change is not just a local problem. It's disrupting the global supply and demand around the world. We see some areas of Europe that have had record heat, and we have some that have seen record flooding. And so that really unbalances that supply and demand. Oop. My apologies. And how can brewers, what can they do? Well, it's communication and operations. Realize that specs are probably going to have to be adjusted with this crop year. And that's just a matter of remembering that we can't fix what happens in the field. You're going to need, in order to optimize your extraction, really watch the mill. And the biggest danger that you have there is the thinner kernels passing through without being crushed. And COAs will likely change, especially as we try and keep crop year 2020 in order to slow that transition to the more difficult 2021 crop. We ask that you be flexible in terms of varieties because yields and quality varies not only between locations, but some barley varieties will be grown in areas that are not as hard hit, as well as some of the varieties have a better ability to deal with drought than others. If worse comes to worse, there is the possibility to do different exogenous enzyme cocktails to mitigate some of the beta glucan issues, or break down a little bit more of the protein, get better access to the starch. I guess my biggest point in this is talk to us. Most of the maltsters have people who have been around for a lot of years and have seen just about everything that Mother Nature can throw at us. So we know what we've had to do to manage a crop like this in the past, and we build on that experience. But definitely that communication between the maltster and the brewery is absolutely key. Yes, we can do some things to change climate change by our behaviors, by our energy use and things like that. But those are a little bit more long-term projects that we have. So we have to be able to do everything that we can to work with the current situation. So again, thank you. I'm sorry I ran a little over time because of I'm how do they say it, old dog, and some of the technology is newer tricks for me. But I can be reached at Mary Jane Maurice at malteurope.com. And I also have a Twitter account at MaltsterMJ. And I know there's not really much opportunity for questions now, but I appreciate you being here, and let's hope for a better crop in 2022. That's, I guess, what we always do. Thank you.